But thanks everyone for coming along to this Marine and Antarctic Studies seminar. As you know, or some of you may not know, the point of these seminars is to have a kind of interdisciplinary investigation of a particular topic and issue. And one of the things about disciplines is that they parcel up things differently. So we thought it'd be very interesting to have a seminar looking at the Antarctic and Southern Ocean region and thinking about how different disciplines across HAAS and STEM parcel that up and what effect that has, how they do it, and when it's a good idea and when it's not. So we've got quite a broad range of researchers today. We've got a physical oceanographer, we've got a marine biologist, and we've got a historian. So we'll have them back to back, and then we'll have some questions at the end. So we're going to start off with the physical environment. So I'll introduce to you Will Hobbs, who many of you will know. He's a physical oceanographer here with the ACIC, the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems CRC. His current research looks at quantifying the impact of human climate forcings on the Southern Ocean. He's got a particular interest in Southern Ocean sea ice changes and has advised international committees, including CAMLAR and the US National Academy of Sciences. He's co-authored research on many aspects of the southern high latitudes, including the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and ecosystem. So I'm very grateful to Will for coming and talking to us today, particularly under difficult PowerPoint circumstances.
Okay, thanks, Ellie, and thanks also for using a 15-year-old photo on the archive. I'm flattered. That's kind of echoey. I'm not sure if the microphone's okay. Okay, so I've been asked to offer a physical scientist perspective on the concept of regionality in the Southern Ocean. And I'm not really qualified to do this because as a climate scientist, time is kind of my dimension. You know, I use spatial maps of change and what have you, but time is definitely my primary dimension. But I have sort of thought a little bit about what regionality thinks. This is a very personal view. I'd like to try and give an overview of how oceanographers think about zones and zonality in the Southern Ocean. I'm also going to play fast and loose a little bit with how we think about regionality, particularly regionality in the sense of a map or horizontal coordinate system. So I'm going to sort of play a little bit around that and argue that maybe other dimensions in the ocean, and particularly the Southern Ocean, are in themselves regions. For those of you who are physical oceanographers, this overview is a very sort of it's not a particularly robust from a physical oceanography point of view, so be kind to me. So I'm throwing out some concepts here in a very sort of woolly fashion. So this is, if you're privileged enough to get to the pelagic Southern Ocean, this is pretty much what you're going to see. This is an image by Steve Rintoul, and you're going to see waves and sea and nothing else. You know, to quote the old Irving Berlin song, I joined the Navy to see the sea, and what did I see? I saw the sea. So when you look at this, whether you're in the Drake Passage or one of the abyssal plains over the Southern Ocean, it's pretty much going to look the same. So from the point of view of a human sort of observer, just looking without any kind of instrumentation, it's difficult to say anything about regionality. It's just a peneplane. It all pretty much is the same. So in some sense, you really need to dip instruments in the water. So as a physical oceanographer, we think about regionality not in terms of anything visible, but in terms of the properties and processes that are going on within this water envelope. Things that you can't really see with the naked eye. I mean, you can see waves, but you can't really see temperature and the mixing of chemical components. So it's also worth noting that the term Southern Ocean is itself disputed. So it's not entirely girdled by land in the way that the other ocean basins are. And that means historically the Southern Ocean as a concept has been somewhat disputed. There's not really an exact definition, and what definitions there are have changed over time. For example, the 1953 edition of the Hydrographic Bureau's definition of basins actually didn't have a Southern Ocean in it. the committee said there was no Southern Ocean, so the other three subarctic basins just went straight down to the Antarctic coastline. So, although most oceanographers today, whether or not they work in this environment, would probably dispute that. Okay, thank you. Would dispute that. There still is no, it's still a fairly, to pardon the pun, but it's a fluid definition. There isn't a strict definition of the Southern Ocean. Okay. What does define the Southern Ocean from a physical oceanographer's perspective? What makes it unique from other ocean basins are two things, though. One is its proximity to the Antarctic coastline and processes involved with ocean and ice interaction that go on there. But perhaps more obviously is the fact that it's zonally continuous. It's unbroken by a continent because it has the Drake Passage. Now, a fluid parcel could theoretically go all the way around. It's not likely to, but it could. Now, you could say the same about the Arctic Ocean as well. But the Arctic Ocean is somewhat separated from the other major ocean basins. It's not completely separated, but it has a limited relationship. So the Southern Ocean, because it has this strong current, the Antarctic Circumpolar current, it's kind of like the food blender of the world's oceans. It takes in water from other oceans, mixes them up, and spits them back out as something else. So it's that zonal continuity that I think, as a physical oceanographer, kind of defines the Southern Ocean. That's what makes it different from the basins and not just an extension of them. Because of that zonal continuity, the physical properties, I'm looking here at a map of salinity at the surface, but you can take temperature at any depth just as easily. It's somewhat isotropic in the sense that you don't get these differences, these east-west gradients in properties that you get in the other ocean basins for things like, signals of El Nino, because you don't get the gyre currents, these circular currents that happen because there are continents, and you don't get western boundary currents and those kinds of things that cause east-west gradients. So from that sense, we tend to think, or we can fall into the trap of thinking, it's a zonally continuous and zonally isotropic ocean. Sorry, I'm trying to manage two computers here. So often, when people start looking at the Southern Ocean, this is going to be your first view of the ocean as an averaged over longitude. So you're just looking at dimensions of depth and latitude. And what you see is what this pattern reveals is what we call an overturning circulation, where the currents act in a vertical up and down motion and north-south. And it drives this overturning circulation, which is a big connection to the global climate. So it's terribly important, really, for everybody on the planet, even though they don't feel it. These vertical motions are a fairly unique link between the surface and the deep ocean. Most of the world, you don't get that link very easily. And it's really only the far North Atlantic that has anything like this kind of connection. But these motions allow the transport of heat, nutrients, and carbon between the deep ocean and the surface. So, for example, the Southern Ocean alone absorbs about 75% of all the heat that's trapped on the planet by anthropogenic emissions into the deep ocean, and about 12% of anthropogenic carbon emissions. So obviously these play a big role in our future and how these processes work. They also play a big role in the ecosystem, because by bringing up that deep water, which is rich in nutrients, you explain largely why the Southern Ocean is so incredibly productive. It's limited not by nutrients, as are many areas in the tropics, but by iron, in fact. in that context, then, what I'd like to argue is that the vertical domain, the vertical dimension, is itself a form of regionality. If you're to dip a hydrographic instrument, or even if you're a vertically migrating animal, you're going to encounter much more differences in a few hundred or thousand meters going vertically than you are going hundreds or thousands of kilometers horizontally, at least in a longitudinal direction. So maybe we can sort of think about depth as a region, as well as sort of our more traditional sense of latitude, longitude, and so on. Now, right, two computers. Now that concept of a sort of zonally symmetric ocean kind of falls down once you get south of the sort of polar front, this region here. Because you get away from that, the strong Antarctic circumpolar current, and into regions where the influence of the Antarctic continent is much more evident. Probably the biggest image, the most powerful image of that lack of zonality is Antarctic Sea Ice Trends, where we know that Antarctic sea ice overall has had a modest increase over the satellite area the last 4 years, but that masks an incredibly complex spatial pattern with quite strong decreases in some regions, at least as strong as anywhere in the Arctic, but counteracted by large increases. Now, much of this lack of zonality is driven by the winds, which, as they hit the continent and interact with the topography of the continent, lose the sort of westerly dominance that you get in the open ocean, and you get these north-south air currents instead. Now, those north-south air currents are like an order of magnitude slower than the zonal winds, but they actually have a much more important impact on local climate because they're moving air masses between the continent and the warmer, moister climes further north. So you're getting this mixing. Just like in Hobart, when you get a north-south air pattern, it's going to be really hot and fiery or really cold and wet. And it's the same thing, and it actually drives the climate. Now, although I've talked about the winds, there are also links here between sea ice and the deep ocean. There are feedbacks in the way that ice, when it forms and when it melts, but those feedbacks aren't the same process everywhere you go. Around this continent, the distribution of the bathymetry, the continental shelf, completely changes those processes, and we're only beginning to understand those. So there is a really strong zonal component to regionality, not just by the winds, but also by the hydrography and the bathymetry of this region. Now, I know that Ellie is tapping her watch. So I'm really going to play fast and loose, so hopefully, well, what a surprise, it's not playing. Whatever. I'm going to argue seasonality is a form of regionality as well. Now, obviously, everywhere subtropical has a seasonal cycle, and we wouldn't think of that as being a different... We think of that as part of that region's, characteristics rather than something separate. In the sea ice zone of the Southern Ocean, though, you're effectively doubling or trebling the size of the Antarctic continent each year. The total difference between maximum and minimum sea ice cover is more than twice the size of Australia. Now, what that means, if you're an animal at the coast, a penguin or a Homo sapiens, nestled in a station, you move from being in a coastal location in the summer to being several hundred kilometers from the open ocean. If you're a human, that affects logistics and when you can get resupply. If you're a penguin, that affects how far you have to walk before you can forage. It almost completely changes the system in a way that simply getting warmer and colder doesn't. So I'd argue that in some sense, seasonality is itself a region because it completely changes the physical system, not just the state in terms of its temperature. So I'm going to wrap it up there. So really, I don't really have an overarching thesis, but I've been trying to just think about different ways in that we think about regionality. There's no definition of regionality in the Southern Ocean. I think it's like every other answer that physical scientists give to any question. It depends. And it really depends more on what question you're trying to answer than on any definitive statement that you can say about the nature of this environment. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Will, for giving us the big physical picture. I found that really, really interesting. So I'll introduce our second speaker now, who's Steve Nicol. And if Will's photo is an old one, and I can't say I actually noticed that when I saw you, so Steve's got a penguin standing on his head, I think, but I don't know where that one came from. Anyway, many of you will know Steve Nicol. He has a BSc in zoology, an MSc in oceanography, a PhD in biology, and an MA in creative writing, which I think is a wonderful combination. He was a research scientist and program leader at the Australian Antarctic Division for a number of years, a couple of decades really, and participated in 9 Antarctic research voyages. He served on the Australian delegation to the Commission of Camellar for almost 25 years. He's published on many aspects of krill biology. Some of us know him as Mr. Krill or Dr. Krill, and the Southern Ocean ecosystem. He's also written a lot of popular science articles, travel writing, short fiction, and some of us are aware of his excellent book, The Curious Life of Krill, that came out earlier this year. He was runner-up in 2014 for the Tasmanian Writers' Prize Fiction. And are we having trouble with his PowerPoint as well?
Yeah,
of course we are.
You have good slides. Yeah, well, you've said everything anyway, though. Can I just...
Were there any IT guys around? No.
This is workable. This is workable, so if I just...
Yeah, just point to work.
That's fine. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Ellie. Thanks, everyone, for having me.
It's surprisingly similar to Will's. So the brief was to explore whether, when and how they should be divided into separate zones, what impact this segmentation has on our knowledge of this part of the planet. Now, of course, scientists as a group are highly segmented, and so the answers you're going to get when you look at regionalization depend very much on which scientist you're talking to. And Will has given us the physical oceanographer's view of the world, and I'm going to give you a marine biologist's point of view. They're looking around the room, and there's several marine biologists here who know a lot more about this than me, so they'll probably have a very different point of view. So it depends also on what you're interested in. If you're interested in biogeographic zones or biogeochemical zones, you're going to divide the ocean up in one way. If you're looking at particular species groupings, that's another way. If you're looking at particular processes, that gives you another perspective. And then there's conservation and fisheries management, which involve generally quite a few of those concepts. So I just thought I'd put this one up here, partly because it's a very strange slide. They seem to have left the island of my birth off there. But other than that, what I wanted to show was that Antarctica is really a very big place, and not surprisingly, there's a lot of regionality. You know, people don't seem to realize that the difference between Hobart and Brisbane is the same as the length of the Antarctic Peninsula. So you'd expect very real differences in the distance from the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula down to the base of it, and then also into these other regions as well. So there is this idea that Antarctica is this continent sitting on the South Pole. It's basically circular and everything's the same, but that's not the case. There are vast regional differences. Now this is something we tried a few years ago, looking at the differences between the various frontal zones, the sea ice advances and retreats, the continental shelf, and so on, and add them all together and see if you can actually come up with a regionality that defines productivity in the Southern Ocean as a product of how much continental shelf there is in an area, how far it is from the polar front, and so on and so forth. But we ended up, I think you were a co-author on this, weren't you, Pete? I think the bottom line was it's kind of complex. There is no simple answer. So we were looking for the holy grail of what defines why one region is more productive than the other. And the answer is there's a whole lot of different factors involved. And these do involve things like the continental shelf, the distance to the polar front, and the extent of winter sea ice and summer pack ice. But you can actually make a few generalizations about this. And the nice thing about these generalizations is you can actually reduce them to acronyms as well, which is wonderful. So you have the southern boundary of the ACC known as the SBACC, the permanently open zone, open ocean zone, or POOZ, the seasonal ice age, I'll stop there, ice age. And so basically, the idea is that you've got these rings around Antarctica, and as you come south, you go through these different physical, biological zones. And then when you get down to Antarctica, you've also got these embayments and peninsulas and so on, and there's the coastal zone. So you can, at the simplest level, define the Antarctic like that. But it's not quite that simple, as I said. Overlaying this, you've got the vast expansion and contraction of sea ice. And then underneath all this, you've got the biological communities. And this is a very old slide from Graham Hosey that shows that as you get south, you have a northern oceanic community of animals, which you can characterize by particular species. You then get into a second oceanic community, the other side of the Antarctic divergence, the front. And then you come into the krill-dominated community, which is obviously the most important. And this is what we used to think of as the Southern Ocean was this great big soup of krill. But the more we discover it, investigate it, the more you discover it's actually a fairly restricted zone. It expands out in some areas and contracts in others, but it's not, krill are not ubiquitous within the Southern Ocean. They have a habitat. And one of the key areas of study at the moment is, what actually defines that habitat? And we don't really know yet. Then you get into onto the coast, onto the continental shelf, and you get a completely different community. And these communities can actually be very distinct. There can be just knife-edge separation between what you find in, say, the krill-dominated community and the neritic community. And that can be at a frontal zone or at the edge of one of the current systems. So you can, on a large scale, do this, but you can't go to this area and say, I expect to find krill here, because you may well not find them, because these are not hard and fast boundaries. Now, within ecological zones, there are hotspots, and this is, again, something that's a hot topic at the moment, and this is a satellite image of the Southern Ocean, and at the simplest level, what we're looking at is the red areas are where you've got lots of production, and these blue areas are where you've not got much at all. And so what you're looking at here is considerable regionality. There are places where there's a lot of production, and then there's places where there isn't much production. And so that structures the system in a lot of ways. And what you might think is that, well, let's look where the production is most. That's where you'd expect to find krill. Well, it actually doesn't quite work out that way. These grey patches are where krill are reputed to be quite abundant, and if you can remember back to the last slide, they don't actually match particularly well against where you're finding all the primary production. And this can be for a whole range of reasons, one of which is that if you get a lot of krill in an area, they've eaten all the food. That's nice and simple. There are also temporal mismatches, and it also may be because krill and other herbivores live deep in the water. And this is the other dimension that Will was talking about, is that you find that you were talking about a three-dimensional environment here, and a lot of our techniques, such as satellites, look at the very surface layer. But when you actually look deeper, you find that there's a huge amount of structure there. This is what a krill swarm looks like as you pass over it in a ship with an echo sounder, and you can see there's a vast amount of structure there. The red bits are where it's really dense. and the white bits is where there's no krill at all. So there is this huge structure just in this depth, and we also know now that krill, we can find them krill right at the surface and right at the sea floor as well. So trying to find out, for instance, where krill habitat is and how it relates to primary production requires that you understand the entire water column. And that's a very difficult concept to grasp. Now, krill predators, again, this is a map of where blue whales and humpback whales were caught in the 20th century, and the black bits are where lots were caught, and the white bits were slightly less, and these areas were none at all. And again, if you map this over the krill distribution, you find that there's a mismatch there as well. You don't actually find most of the whales being caught where there was most of the krill, which is a bit surprising because you would have thought that the really, really big whales would go to where most of the krill were most abundant. So, but they don't. And so you've got this series of mismatches between the primary producers, the herbivores, and the predators. And again, we've got temporal lags in here because this is historical data, whereas what we were looking at before is more up-to-date data. But all the same, it's very difficult to match up exactly the production with the consumption in these systems, and that's a bit of a problem. And, of course, we've got the fact that whales aren't static. It's just not where a whale was killed. Whales live in this environment and migrate into it. So humpback whales migrating down the east coast of Australia head south to the Antarctic continent, to the eastern continental shelf, and they spread out there and begin feeding in that area. Although, again, this is a generalization, they don't all do that. Some of them make a little side trip to New Zealand. So it depends what time of year you would look at your predators to find out a pattern that they might be relating to the other elements of the ecosystem. Because obviously when they're traveling down here, they're not interested in krill because there isn't any krill there. They're going fast through there and then hanging around here where there is krill. And so moving on to the management then, the management of the Southern Ocean has been regionalized, and this is what the International Whaling Commission does. It actually has all these different areas where the commercial whaling was managed, and unfortunately it doesn't actually match up with either the Antarctic Treaty or with CAMLR. So you've actually got 3 different marine management zones, and they don't fit very well together. Luckily, they don't all talk very much together either, so it doesn't really make much difference. If you look at CAMLR, the CAMLR map is even more subdivided. So this is the CAMLR inside the thick red line here. We have what's known as the CAMLR region, and it's split up into area 88, 58, and 48, and even those are split down even further. And these are intended to be management zones. They were intended to incorporate the entire habitat of krill, which is why this is a very strange shape, and it doesn't follow, say, the 60-degree south line that the Antarctic Treaty does. And it's largely successful at doing that, but there are large areas in some of these regions where there is no krill. Okay, so the move within CAMLR is to split these down into even further smaller and smaller areas, because the idea is you don't want your krill to be caught in very small areas, so you can have a smaller management area and spread the catches out. And the krill fishing grounds themselves change with time. This is just to show what happened from the 70s right the way through to the current era, that the fishery was at one point almost circumpolar, but has now restricted its actions until it's now operating only in a very small area. And even in that area, it's become restricted. This is the Antarctic Peninsula in South Georgia. That's most of the fishery. Historical fishery was caught like that. Nowadays, the fishery is caught in these very, very small areas. So there's a change in that. So what we used to think of as the fishery zones have changed. So that regionalization is different, and then that has to interact with the management system that you've got. So the conclusion is that there is no one Southern Ocean. It depends what problem you're trying to solve. There's a range of habitats, and they're often arranged from north to south, but not always. Many species utilize several of these habitats and migrate across them. Surface features are not enough to actually define the regions, and depth is important. There are extreme temporal changes in many of the habitats. We've heard about the sea ice changes, and we haven't mentioned the fact that it's dark for a large portion of the year. Predicting future change is going to understand really complex interactions. So predictions of how the changing ocean is going to affect communities or species is fraught with difficulties. And just to remember that there are exceptions to almost every rule. So I assume that you're confused, as I am now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve, for keeping everybody involved. See what Alessandro can do. So Alessandro Antonello is our visiting speaker here today. He hails from the University of Melbourne. He did his PhD research at ANU under Tom Griffiths, and then worked at the University of Oregon as a postdoctoral fellow for a while, and is now at the University of Melbourne as a Mackenzie postdoctoral fellow in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. So his research concentrates on Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, and international environmental history post-1945. He's got a book coming out in the University Press called The Greening of Antarctica, Assembling an International Environment. So I think it's not often that we have historians speak in these seminars. Don't know if we've ever had one, actually. So I think it would be fun to put these two scientists against the historian and see what comes out of it. Shall we go
now you can see my crappy, my less than ideal formatting.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. Hi, everyone. So our topic today is wholeness and regionality. So I just want to frame this problem or relationship in terms of some of the work I've done, published over the last few years. And I'll try and get through about 4 case studies just to illustrate some of the issues involved from a historical humanities perspective. And hopefully this leads to some discussion. Just to sort of put the take-home messages first. Scale, space, or place, from a humanities geographical perspective, we would say is produced. That doesn't mean fake. It means a framework in which people, humans, have thought about the Earth and written about it, published about it, and that the production of scale or space is something that's consequential or influential, something that produces meaning around which human communities, perhaps they organise power, access, all these kinds of questions. The second take-home point, how people or communities or individuals relate to space changes over time, which has been made a point well made by both Will and Steve, and has effects. So in the case of Antarctica, those effects are geopolitical, so how states allocate power or authority, or they're epistemic, that is relating to the formation of knowledge, or also cultural sensibilities. So humans engage in spatial projects to create conditions or structures for action. So the historical question might be, why do particular spatial regimes come into existence? So, what actors are responsible for a certain idea of space? And the geographical or humanities question might approach, what effect and what meanings does a specific spatial regime have? The third point is to be attentive to mobility through space. 2 of the examples I have regard mobility. So spaces are in part created by material practices within them. So not just by the resultant map, for example. There are lots of maps in this on this slideshow. And the final point is that clearly Antarctic history shows a great tension between relatively localised, regionalised action and claims regarding the whole region. So part of this is clearly related to the fact that at the start of the 20th century, we knew almost nothing about Antarctica. And so the continual revelation of knowledge about the natural environment is a continuing process and has an effect in human meaning, in culture. It also the change over time revolves around the nature of the actors involved in the region, so states, empires, scientists individually, or with the universities, or with state institutions like the Antarctic Division, or with international institutions like SCAR. And I would also suggest, it's interesting that Will and Steve have agreed in a good way, but also that, in fact, the division between the disciplines in the sciences has also had an effect on this. So just to sort of hawk my own wares, these are two publications from the last few years in which I've addressed some of these issues. And I know that perhaps several people in this room who've contributed to the book on the right, the Handbook on the Politics of Antarctica, as well as on the left. And I'll lead with a quote that I used in the publication on the right. Although the Antarctic is certainly one very big space, it is also a region composed of many spaces. These abut, overlap, compete, interconnect, are separate and distinct, formal or informal, temporary or permanent, strictly or loosely bounded. The Antarctic and Southern Ocean region is not a homogeneous wilderness, a majestic and wild and entirely uniform, but, as Christy Collis, a geographer in Queensland, has argued, a complex cultural space. Bold point here, conceptions and treatments of Antarctica as a totality or whole are historically and geographically specific. And I'll, just to open, before I get to the case studies, is to suggest just three of the ways in which Antarctica has been thought of as a whole. We can think about the Antarctic should be British. So in 1920, Leo Amery, a junior minister in the British government, came across the idea that perhaps this unclaimed territory should in fact be fully British. The British Empire, just to remind the non-historians in the room who might think the British Empire was at its height in the 18th or 19th century, in fact the British Empire wasn't at its geographical height, its geographically maximum extent until well after the First World War. This included claiming Antarctica. So we might ask, who were the first people to think of Antarctica as a single totality? Well, part of our answer might be, well, the British. They saw it as a single region to control for imperial purposes. By 1926, however, when this imperial policy was announced, the pesky French had got in the way and claimed Adelie Land, and that put paid to the British claiming the whole continent. We might look next to the post-Second World War period when, as we move into a world defined by the Cold War, defined by superpower rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, we see that these two superpowers also find it useful to think about and portray the Antarctic as being a single entity, a unified region. I like this map a lot from 1956, published by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. Even though America did not recognise the claims on this map, the territorial claims on this map, it uses its discoveries to say how sort of continent-spanning its activities were. Those grey areas are areas, as you can see, areas seen only by US explorers, mostly from planes at this stage. We can look then at a similar time. This map is from 1959 from a Soviet historical geography atlas. Drawing these lines upon the map, so remember my point about mobility, how the Soviets, we can see I don't usually use, these lines are Soviet lines. These are the great traverses of the IGY that the Soviets made. The red lines, naturally the red lines are Soviet. I think the black lines or the blue lines might be American, so you can see how the Soviets want to show that they are more, they encompass the whole region geographically. So the first of let's just sort of just suggest the ways in which just to suggest this geopolitical vision of the whole. My first of my four examples is the discovery investigations. So these investigations created in 1920 by the British government, the British imperial government, to investigate primarily the biological nature of the South Atlantic region of the Southern Ocean in aid of the whaling industry, which had begun at the start of the 20th century in that region. As we can see from this map, the discovery investigations concentrated themselves in the South Atlantic Ocean, but in fact, in 1932, the discovery 2, now again, Discovery 2, that's the original Discovery Scots ship, which was only used in the first few voyages. The Discovery 2 made the first circumpolar navigation of Antarctica in 1932. That was the first one since Biscoes 100 years before. And in fact, it was the Discovery investigations that George Deacon, the very prominent hydrologist, was the this is the historic version of what Will and Steve showed. This is George Deacon's first visual representation of the vertical circulation of what he was still calling then the South Atlantic Ocean. George Deacon, amongst others, is the first to suggest that, in fact, the Southern Ocean is one single ocean, one single oceanographic entity. I put this one, I'll come back to this. One of the other major outcomes of the Discovery investigations was the very famous 1962 report by James Marr on the natural history of krill. I love this diagram because it's I just find it slightly ridiculous that here are just different shapes of krill patches I have seen in the Southern Ocean. Marr took decades to write this report, and this is slightly flipped, but also perhaps a more aesthetic way of approaching this idea of regionality and wholeness in the Antarctic Ocean, the sort of morphologies that are experienced of the ocean and the way of thinking about it. These are obviously only surface observations, so obviously very different to what our capacities are now. Yes, as I've mentioned, that the Discovery investigations, despite their concentration in the South Atlantic, because of only 2 circumpolar voyages, these British scientists, through this imperial venture, claim the continuity of the Southern Ocean as a single oceanographic entity. I worked a few years ago on the history of glaciology, and I published this article in Environmental History a few years ago, trying to think about the ways in which these ostensibly huge bodies of ice, which we invariably conceive of as single unit, giant bodies of ice now, were very slowly encountered, or they were encountered in very specific ways. And this is just to return to my point about mobility, that well into the 1960s and 70s, indeed in the pre-satellite era, the only way of encountering the Antarctic ice sheet, of thinking about the Antarctic ice sheet in its various ways, was along these lines of traverses. And it's really interesting when you revisit the historical record that all the glaciologists doing this work are very conscious of the limits of their work. Gordon Robin, the Anglo-Australian scientist, the first to lead seismic sounding over here, in the Norwegian, British, Swedish expedition in the early 1950s, called traversing an art, a science, and a sport. And it's sort of to remind us that the slow idea of completeness, of wholeness, is an achievement over decades. But it occurred to me that the ice sheet is sort of endlessly giving of this idea of completeness. I think many of you will have seen the news a few months ago. The Minnesota Polar Geospatial Center put out what many news agencies were calling the most complete map of any continent ever. That's the reference elevation model of Antarctica, the Polar Geospatial Center put out. And so I think there's this interesting idea of complete vision, of completion, that certain institutions can use to build their authority over the Antarctic. Yep. Those who came to my paper will know I'm obsessed with environmental impact statements at the moment. These really interesting impact statement documents from the 1970s, in which the United States, producing these documents, really builds this picture of a whole region that if there is a fisheries industry, if there is a mining industry, well, we'll conceive of the impacts of those extractive industries on the whole region, rather than their localized impact on stocks. Rushing through, and just ending with Kamala. I mean, Steve has briefly mentioned this, but if we think, if we think back to the late 1970s, when the negotiators of Kamala were at work, how did they think of the Southern Ocean? Well, just to go back to Will's point about the definition of the Southern Ocean, in fact, it was in the early 1970s is when the International Hydrographic Organization was once again trying to get agreement about what this thing was called the Southern Ocean. There was no agreement at that time, but in fact, the label Southern Ocean sort of reasserts itself in the 1970s. These two images are from the impact statement drawn by the modeler Catherine Green, who studied under the very prominent primary production biologist Syed El-Sayed. And so in the late 1970s, in fact, the ways in which the Southern Ocean was seen were either as this whole or in this diagrammatic sense that Green herself had developed. Just to circle the square node, to tie off this discussion, part of my point is that these long historical ways of seeing the continent, the region, whether it's in whole or in dividing it up into sections, has consequences in terms of how management might be occurring today, in terms of how it's occurred in the past, in terms of how different nations, different institutions have approached the continent, and therefore how they've made claims about the whole place as well. So hopefully that's understandable, and thanks for being here.